let's see, if we were to attack here, what I want to see the shape of these guys. Okay, they're still maybe a little too good of condition to attack. Need to starve a little more. Yeah, they should starve a little more. But back to the historical thing. The Japanese were nowhere near a nuclear weapon. I think it was Mark Felton Presents or Mark Felton Productions or whatever, his YouTube channel. I think I saw something that he examined. I think it was him that examined the Japanese nuclear weapon system, or programs. There were two of them. And they were just, I mean, they were just sort of conceptually sort of thinking about it kind of thing. You know, 10 guys in a laboratory experimenting with stuff, kind of, you know, it's like nowhere near making a bomb. Germany was working that way towards it. They actually had a realistic idea of what it would take to make where the Japanese didn't. What it would take to make a bomb. I still don't see Germany making a bomb in the time. Obviously, they didn't, and they were trying to, but I just don't know. I guess that's the biggest thing. There's so much information lost. One of these Discovery Channel shows, and some of them have been trash, that whole hunting Hitler thing. I watched the series because I was sort of fascinated by it. And had that just been hunting Nazis or something, it might have been good, but the whole idea that Hitler survived the war, blah, 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 is just so much BS. But one of the shows that they're looking at one of the underground facilities that the Nazis were making, and they go in with Geiger counter type things, and they're showing the high levels of radiation. And I think it's much more than natural radiation in the mountain cave area. I used to just entirely dismiss the Nazi nuclear program. Yeah, I remember way back when, as a kid, watching Hogan's Heroes and, you know, Hogan sabotaging whatever Nazi program dealing with heavy water, blah, blah, blah. And that it just so far from coming about. Well, and again, this is an area of the war I'm not, you know, generally the nuclear programs, but we talked the Manhattan Project. I'm not terribly familiar with, but I know a bit. The United States built, city might be too big of a term, but a fairly large town. They built at least two fairly large towns for the project. Now, the Manhattan Project gets its name from Manhattan, here in New York, because they had a secret research facility in the middle of the city that was just in some sort of regular buildings that they sort of sectioned off, and it was very hard to get in. So it looked like the people were going to work in an office building. Now, I don't think any of those people had really they weren't anywhere near like making a bomb. They were just more theorists working on things and living in New York, meaning there was nothing to blow up to harm the city or anything like that. Now, if the bad guys had found out about it, well, wait a minute, they did. Those were the communists. But if other bad guys had found out about it and had been able to plant a bomb and blow the facility up, yeah, it would have. But there was no like radioactive material, to the best of my knowledge. It was just a bunch of guys in an office, kind of thing. But I think it was in Tennessee. They build a sort of a quick fabricated city type facility, and there's still some huge buildings, like 3-4 story big huge industrial complexes. You just sit, just sitting there to this day. rotting away because their machines, they were the machines that separated out, and God, I know I'm not good at this, but separate out the fissionable materials or whatever. And they're a big waste hazard, and they're sort of contained inside the machine. So don't know whether it's better to leave them where they are, or try to dismantle them, and then package up the dangerous material and bury it somewhere else. But they built a whole city to support these people. Often women were doing a lot of this work, to keep it all secret. And to get in there and to even get into this sort of complex. And it was meant so that people could live their lives without leaving the complex, so that they wouldn't be talking to other people. But there's 4 or 6 of these huge buildings that they put these separating machines in, and big project. And then of course you have out in Los Alamos, out here, where the testing facilities were, where they're building taking some of that material and putting it together. And the reason they were doing this in Tennessee was, I believe, it connected to the Tennessee Valley Authority electrical development program. You needed a lot of electricity. There were lots of relatively small hydro dams built around in this area, so they were able to have the electricity here locally to run these plants, is my understanding, but maybe that has nothing to do with it. I don't know, but that's my understanding. Centrifuges, that's right. Thank you, IKB. IKB is very good on industrial things. So, so they're doing that type of work out there, and that's dealing with hazardous materials. And I think they're dealing it relatively safe, definitely as safe as they think I'm pretty sure that they can make it with the technology that they have, at the time. Now out here is where they're assembling all this stuff and testing a couple of the bombs. And there's, again, whole sort of cities built to facilitate their operation here. Well, and there's 2 different processes, uranium and plutonium was it, that the U.S. was taking 2 different paths, and they make 2 different bombs using the 2 different materials, because early on they're not sure whether one or both will work, and how much material they have in their facility, in their capable, getting to put together, and how much is it going to take of this material to actually make the bomb. The Japanese one, they thought it was going to take a whole lot less material, and they thought they'd easily get the radio, the uranium or whatever. I forget which version they were looking at, but they were nowhere. They had trouble getting it. They were nowhere making even anything go puff. It was more just sort of working on some things, and very, very underfunded. Now funds, and again, I have the trouble with black ice, in that they see funds as money, and some of the stuff is sort of money. But as we can sort of see, and again, if you watch some of TIK's videos, it's not so much money as the issue, it's resources. For any of these projects, you need steel. There's enough steel showing up. There's enough iron showing up, to whether to build a building, or to build one of these centrifuges, or to build whatever, is it showing up, or is it being put into submarines and tanks? It's allocation of resources. I just had not seen evidence of much allocation of resources. Yes, there were some German scientists working on all kinds of projects, but again, a lot of that is, 10 guys in a laboratory somewhere, and they're testing things out and recording it and making observations and saying, well, this, could become a bomb maybe, or something, but that doesn't mean they're anywhere close to it. Well, I've reevaluated my understanding of nukes is that Germany was further down the path because they were definitely very much dealing with heavy water coming out and concerned about it. And that's what the British were very concerned with. I'm forgetting, it's up in this area. Well, do we have a resource map here? Here. Well, yeah. Where? No, I thought it was more up here. I don't know. Wherever. Nukes are not that hard to make, but if Japan would have its own nuke, it wouldn't it vindicate U.S. using a nuke? Okay, well, I'll get to that in a moment, maybe. Yeah, I think, yes, that would be a good point, because people are bringing it up, because it was the anniversary recently. Either heavy water, because they blow up the ferry, and the raids that they send the Norwegians on, that into, I'm just blanking on some of the names, into Norway. The Germans were really, really concerned about and getting some heavy water out of Norway to dealing with this program. So I've reevaluated that the Germans might have, through their processes and the amount of resources they were throwing at the project, might have gotten something going. And it, had everything not been collapsing. I mean, that's, doesn't, because we just talked about the forever war. What if it's, we're facing a ticking time bomb. I am not here so worried at this playthrough that the Soviets are going to defeat me with what's going on, even though, and you just give it time, we can get, we just have a few divisions. Well, we have a bunch of these divisions that could be, once we get through some of this other production, and some of these are, 2.3 ICs, and that's hardly any. But get some of the, shift some of the production to other units. I'm not so worried about the Soviets coming in and crushing me. What I'm worried about is facing off against the Western allies, the hammer blows coming that way. So you've got to take down the Soviet Union before those other hammer blows. And that's sort of what got me, the forever war and the nukes. So, had it been looking something sort of like this, as time goes on, the Germans are fighting in the Eastern Front. The Eastern Front is still, into the Soviet Union. They've defeated a North Africa landing. They've defeated a, D-Day style landing somewhere, but they still haven't taken Britain. And, the Americans are sitting off over there. This sort of thing's going on for a few years, and the Germans are able to, keep the air war from destroying German industry. Not that there's no bombings, but they're shooting down a lot of airplanes, and the Western allies, the British and Americans, are evaluating how much can they afford to bomb compared to just its losses of, you should attack there, losses due to pilot losses, airplane losses, and just not being effective enough due to day fighters and night fighters and AA guns and all that. And had that gone on, I've now reevaluated to where maybe 46 or 47 Germany could have gotten a bomb. Obviously, I don't think they were anywhere near even testing a proper bomb out, but I think they were much further along on the development phase of it. I am sure, not that I have facts of, but I'm just sure that the collapsing state, especially post June 1944, D-Day, that resources, the program may still have had a fairly high priority in getting a lot of resources, but I'm sure there has to be interruptions because the bombings bomb railways, so things don't get delivered and whatever. So it's slowing up whatever process they're doing. So yeah. Now, and let's see. Most problem nukes is you need overpressure to protect workers and fitters. Yeah. also you need to shield stuff and separate means, but in World War didn't care about worker safety that much. Well, I would say the Americans generally cared about worker safety. I know this is going down the rabbit hole a bit. Veronica Lake, very, very beautiful woman. We would now today maybe think of her as a minor movie star, but she was something of a style influential movie star of the time, of the early 1940s, 41, 42. She starred in a movie, This Gun's for Hire. Now, I'm a big old movie buff fan, so I know a lot of these things. Starring Robert Ladd, but she was the main woman in it. She had a sort of a peekaboo hairstyle in which her hair would come and cover about half of her blonde hair, cover about half of her face and one of her eyes. And that was sort of her stylistic hair, that with her signature. People recognized her because of her hair kind of thing. And she had it through 2 or 3 movies. And then literally the U.S. government came and talked to her about her hair. Not exactly sure who in the U.S. government, but somebody does. And I actually, got a sort of publicity still that she did. They were concerned, and I don't know if there was any recorded incidences of it, but they were concerned that her hairstyle either was or would cause injuries to women. So, and there's even a publicity still in which there's a big drill press and she's had her hair wrapped around the drill press. Now, obviously it didn't happen like when the machine was going because her face would have been slammed into it, but it's sort of wrapped around in it. And they were worried about this because of all the women workers in industry with this peekaboo hairstyle. So they did this publicity, photo shoot, and I just have one of the stills, again, just digital copies, not originals or anything like that, but just for a possible event. All this stuff, with that, hey, this hairstyle's bad for working in industry. And she specifically, from that point on, and I think to a point this actually ends up killing her career because she no longer has this trademark hairstyle, but has her hair on both sides pulled up back into, a bun would be a wrong term and definitely not the Princess Leia, 2 buns on each ear, but sort of a braided, but not pigtails or anything going down, but braided sort of into itself and all contained up on her head so that her longer hair was all contained in her head. And this was done for over women's worker safety. I would say, particularly in America, they were very concerned. I mean, to the point that, we have this movie star and we're having a lot of women, mimicking her hairstyle. We're worried about their safety. Let's get this fixed, kind of thing. So that's just anecdotal evidence, but I would say, they were concerned. One of the guys gets one of the guys working in the greater parts elements of the Manhattan Project does get radioactive poison, and he realizes he doesn't have much time left, but he continues working and documenting his disease and what's going on for future workers to be safe. He knows he's dead. 6 months to live, whatever it was, because it was pretty bad. But he continues to work, works very hard because it's in the middle of a war, and he is trying to document stuff so this doesn't happen with others. So yes, manpower, IKB, manpower, material, construction equipment. If you want to know what is missing, follow the trail of how much concrete and manpower signed delivered versus what was on the ground compared to what else was built with comparable resources. That will show you what is hidden, missing. Absolutely. But so many records are destroyed. Nazis were wonderful, wonderful record keepers, kept records in multiple formats, but between bombings and particularly the Nazis, and could just be all kinds of levels of files. They just dumped so much stuff on, bonfires towards the end of the war. One of the guys who book Hitler's Compromises, if you want to learn about how the Nazis ran Germany as opposed to Nazis running conquered territories, which was very different between the two. He looks at records, including some of the original SS records. The SS, I know I'm jumping all over topics here, but the SS would send out SS agents to go stand in lines of, rationing lines, or, lines waiting for the train or whatever. And they would just listen to people and take notes. And I don't think stand there, take notes, so people saw it. And they weren't arresting anybody. It wasn't to try to arrest or find any dissidents. It was just a basic sort of honest polling campaign. They wanted to find out what people were talking about. Not just women, because all kinds of people stood in, older people, people not in, at the front, stood in lines to get rationed materials, including food and whatnot. So they stood in lines and listened to people talk and recorded what they were saying. This without even trying to get names, or this wasn't secret police trying to harm anybody. This was just an ongoing program that starts before the war starts, but continues on through the war to find out what the German people are saying and thinking. Now, most of these records are gone, but because they were, would type things up afterwards in multiple copies, send one to, the Berlin SS headquarters, and one would be kept locally on file. It was from some of the regional files that didn't get bonfired that he was able to do some of his work. So let's just say he got the Bavaria areas. I'm just pulling this out of the hat. I'm sure I know he talks about in the book, but it's just been a few years since I read his book now. That they got those for some periods of time relatively intact, or maybe it's even a sub area. But most of the records of them doing this are just gone, as far as anyone knows. So the Nazis did wonderful jobs at destroying records. But you're absolutely right, IKB. But I don't know that we have the good records to do it. And IKB is right for, especially, and they were wasteful at the disposable manpower. Just on a utilitarian element, because by the time they're starting to get mildly well trained, they're dying, and they're constantly doing this, even if they're sort of ditch diggers and basic stuff. I understand food is short, and I understand that they don't want these people to be alive at the end of it, not because it's a secret program, just because they're trying to get rid of people, but they're very, very too short-sighted on what's going on. You get a lot of people come in their mouths in the military clock factory, so it doesn't surprise me that someone would get that hair thing seriously. Yeah, absolutely. It was a serious. Nazis were so good they saved proofs of their own court cases. Absolutely. They did that too, and they kept huge amounts of records. But huge amounts of records, I know for a fact, were destroyed. I don't have a good hold on it, but I do think a huge amounts of stuff is destroyed record wise. So they have disposable labor, but. And it's one thing if you know that, we need somebody, to muck out radioactive junk and they're going to die. So you get really, again, this is abhorrent behavior, but it's maybe effective. You get some labor that's disposable, but there's so much more labor that had they just fed a little bit better, had they treated just a little bit better, they would have ended up surviving the war because whatnot, but they would have also been more effective in Nazi Germany's industry, and might have prolonged the war for the Nazis had they, not that we want that to happen, but had they treated some of these workers a bit better. It probably would have been better. Okay, now on to the dropping of the bomb on, or the two bombs, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and justification. I absolutely think it's entirely justified. I am happy that they dropped the bombs on Japan. The 2 bombs dropped on Japan, to the best of my knowledge, didn't do any more damage than the fire bombings, the bombings that they were already doing in other cities in Japan, including Tokyo. Now, you could argue, I remember Feynman memoirs where he was a consultant on a plant for manufacturing enriched nuclear materials and had some problems reading engineering symbols on a blueprint. Happy, yeah. Oh yeah, you're right about that. Reading, yeah, the skill levels of people aren't always so great. But okay, I'm happy they dropped because they were bombing Japan. I have absolutely no regret, remorse. I mean, obviously I wasn't there, so I'm not responsible for it, but no bad feelings that my nation, and we are the inheritors of both the good and the bad that our nations do. It's not so much collective guilt or whatever, but it is sort of, how we got here. And I'm, as a historian, in World War II, because any of the bombings against Germany, against Italy, against Romania, bombing Ploesti, bombing Japan, of 2 factors that I'm going to say that I have no moralistic qualms about any of the bombing campaigns, including Bomber Harris's viewpoints were like you guys know, the American guy who eventually, sets up bombing, for the Air Forces that comes later in the war. What's his name? Sorry. I'm sure if I heard it, if you want to post American bombing general. For 2 reasons. One, and I'll start with the main one. The war was not just combat soldiers fighting combat soldiers. Every single day, the Nazis existed in power. Every single day, the Japanese existed in power. They were doing horrific butchery to peoples. We can particularly see in the Nazis dealing with the Jews, but the Jews were just the big evil group, the bugaboo. They were trying to also erase Poland. Recently got some more material on the general government here of. Let me just say this because I'm sure it's going to crash after this long of a pause if I don't save this now. So I think this is an important talk here. They were trying to, this is the general government. They call it the general government. The general government of what? They never said, because they were trying to erase Poland. And part of the way of erasing Poland was to, and I'll get to some of the chat here in a moment. You probably have good points. But was a hunger strategy, starvation. That includes Czechoslovakia. They thought they could Germanize, and that the people weren't too racially wrong. Thought they could Germanize the Czechs, but they also thought they needed to starve out a fair amount of Czechs too, starve them over time. This gets back to the sort of disposable. They wanted to starve these people out, and they knew they probably couldn't easily do it because the German people would be too revolted to do it during peacetime. I mean, they're not quite as Stalin and the Holodomor wanting to starve out Ukraine because, well, one, he was worried about his industrial power base, sort of the Leningrad, Moscow axis or whatever, if you will, of Soviet industry, and wanting to make sure that they had food and they weren't revolting. That's part of the reason, but also the sort of Ukrainian nationalist element here that wasn't ever terribly. Well, I don't really think ever. I mean, there were Ukrainian Bolsheviks for sure, but I don't think it was ever terribly fond of the Bolsheviks, and definitely never fond of sort of the Stalinish regime even before the Holodomor. So every day you're in existence, the Nazis are purposely trying to eliminate large batches of people, and not just the Jews, millions of other people, civilians, and not just because they happen to live in the city of Stalingrad, and then there's a big, I'm in Rostov here, obviously. There's a big battle going on, so civilians die. It's sort of like when Americans are attacking and clearing out, cities and towns in this part of the world. Sometimes they're throwing grenades into basements because they hear people in there and they're just the civilians in there and they're killing them. But they're not doing it because they thought there were civilians there and the civilians were resisting. Is people, didn't understand, hey, is anybody in there? Come out with your hands up, and no one's coming out. And so in goes a grenade and boom, not just because, innocents are caught in the crossfire, but because every day the Nazis are in power, they are in one format or another, not just in the high-tech, gas chamber settings, but are killing large batches of people. Whether they're innocents or not, they're killing large batches of people. Japan, and they have how much do I describe of the horrors that Japan is doing? What is it? I forget the number. It's like Unit 712 or whatever. They're doing chemical warfare testing on humans in large batches. We see the Japanese pulling out prisoners of war. Lots of them, probably the most of them, are Chinese or other Asians, but also Europeans, pulling them out and using them literally for target practice to harden up the Japanese soldiers. And so they're shooting humans. Just bring them out. They photograph it. They're shooting humans. And of course, there's a couple of guys that have a contest during the raping of Nanking. I know all these things are probably going to get this video demonetized now that I'm saying all this stuff. The raping of Nanking going on, but two guys sort of, two Japanese officers with their samurai swords sort of have a chop off or something in which, who gets to, line up. Not, these aren't like running down and killing people that are running away in terror or combat. These are just like lining people up and maybe with their hands tied behind their back or whatever, cutting their heads off. And now that was just sort of, a few days of horror, but they're continuing this process in China throughout the whole existence of the Japanese occupying China. Okay, so number one, why I have zero. Now, yeah, Romania, fascist Italy, they're doing nothing on this scale. They're doing fascist Italy, fascist Romania, fascist Hungary are doing nothing on the scale, even proportionally scaled down to the size of their country or their occupation. They're doing nothing like that. There is one big sort of massacre after, I forget whether it was an assassination or I think it was an assassination attempt of one of the high-ranking, whether it was the governor or whatever, for, Ethiopia. But I mean, he's actually like shot, he's wounded, and they kill a few thousand people or something like that as in retaliation. Like, don't you do this. And that's about as bad as it gets, as far as I know. There may be worse things, I don't know, but that's about as bad as it gets. They lock up a few thousand mafioso types and supporters and put them in prison camps. But to the best of my knowledge, even there, they're not trying to starve them to death. Now, the Americans liberate them and use them to run occupied Italy, which basically puts the mafia in charge of southern Italy, and maybe still to this day. Because of that, but Mussolini cleaned up. Yeah, so, if you look at some of these other countries doing nothing to the, even if you go, well, Romania is not as big or controlled as much territory, absolutely, but even to the scale of Romania or to the scale of occupation of Italy, doing nothing bad, but they were still supporting, whether, and trust me, at some high level, they all knew, not necessarily every Italian soldier knew that, oh, yes, they're gassing Jews up in Germany somewhere. No, but at some high enough level, politically, these leaders knew what was going on in Germany. So purely on that moral thing to end the war earlier, the mass bombings. Now, maybe they weren't effective. Maybe there was more effective. That mostly the Americans in Europe are trying to target specific factories, where the British, because of various reasons, decide to do night bombing before the Americans come in, partially because they can't escort the bombers to the targets. The bombers are not as well protected as later American bombers. All these reasons, they're doing night bombing, so they're doing more area bombing. Now, and I almost caught his name in my mind. LeMay, Curtis LeMay, that's who I was thinking, the American bombing guy, who comes over and runs the bombing campaign over Japan. They do not go in for the precise bombing once they get Iwo Jima and a few of the other islands that they can, Guam and what I think they take off from Guam and bomb and come back, and in Iwo Jima eventually is used and saves hundreds of lives, if not more, of bunch of airplanes sort of land, maybe to the point of crash landing, just because if they're damaged and need a place to set down that's closer. It's more of an auxiliary air base than a primary bombing air base. Curtis LeMay, instead of trying to go for the precision bombing over Europe and seeing the problems, because the precision bombing is designed and developed by the Americans, putting the bomb in the pickle barrel thing, which they actually sort of kind of could do, was done out here where the weather's clear. Well, the weather isn't as clear in Europe at the same altitudes to be able to do it. He decides, instead of trying to do precise bombing, is high altitude bombing. So they use the high altitude pressurized bombers that are not used in Europe. They're coming on a bit later. So, and he realizes he can't just, target the factories in Tokyo. They specifically try not to bomb the Imperial Palace. They have orders not to do so. But basically just they got to bomb the city because it's so high they can't separate out factories from and the bomb landing pad period, even though they may be trying to go for the factories. I know that was the desire, but they just got to bomb the city, and obviously bombing civilians. But because of the horrors that Japan is doing, and I know that the Japanese, because it's still the same, the modern German government is not the continuation of the Nazi government. The modern Japanese government is the continuation of the Japanese government that did all this, because it's the same imperial family, and the imperial family had this going on, and they could have stopped it. They supported it at, the China invasion and all that stuff at some level. So the horrors that Japan and Germany were committing on the world on an ongoing daily basis, to me, alone justifies mass bombing campaigns. We can talk about whether they were effective or not in shortening the war. That's another thing. And I don't know, somebody may be bringing up oh, the Dresden campaign, there was no industry and people refugee. No, that's all bullshit. No, that's lies. They were going after industry. There was industry there. They were going after it. They weren't just going after just to punish German civilians. So that's one element of the justification and that's enough. But I'll give you a second justification. Is that both Germany and Japan started the mass bombings of primarily civilian, even though the civilians may have also had a military component in that it's like making weapons or even feeding soldiers, food production. Bombings in Britain, in Spain, in just bombing Warsaw, bombing Rotterdam, bombing other places, that they did that. And Japan, sneak attack on Hawaii, Honolulu, but then they were strafing. They weren't. They had a very, and I will get to some of the chat. Van Bishop, I see you guys, and thank you for posting, and I will cover some of that in a moment. They had a very tight target list for the Japanese attacks on Pearl Harbor. Carriers first, and if you can't do that, then the battleship row, and it was very tightly coordinated. But we do know that either because some of the targets were not achievable by them, or they had already dropped their bombs, but we do see some bombings that are obviously nowhere near. They weren't like near misses to those buildings. They were in other parts of the greater Honolulu area or greater Pearl Harbor area, not just on Ford Island where the ships are normally moored, but because it's actually an island that they in the middle of the harbor, and that's where they because they don't normally keep the big ships tied up next to a a pier that you could walk on and walk off. They were normally moored out on sort of permanent moorings, and you use boats going to and from them. And they only because it's rather difficult to move these big huge ships right docking, and I think that they didn't quite have some of the modern technology that we do today for maneuvering ships and whatnot. Just easier to moor them. And they only for proper work on them did they move the battleships or the carriers onto, dock them into what we would think of as more of a dock. So they're sort of separated out. But they were, and then also on Ford Island is where they had the naval, both float plane as well as, so that they went down into the water, as well as the, standard runways on there. Those were all naval. But then there were Air Force air bases on the mainland of the island, on Honolulu, not on Ford Island, and other facilities, that there were definitely bombs dropped on other buildings, not just near or misses of some of the target priorities. Plus, they were strafing with their machine guns civilian targets. And we know that, there's enough information that it wasn't just because of dogfights or the few American aircraft. It was well-documented actual strafings of civilian targets that Japan does there. Japan also, who is not a signatory of the Geneva Convention, so they're beastly to... mentioned before, using soldiers of any nation, not just, I feel it more when it's, Anglo-American soldiers, certainly, but using any soldiers just as random target practices, just for the sake of target practicing, and other sort of bad behavior military-wise. And of course, we can look at, again, how they take Nanking, however you want to say it, not just in the combat of the taking of the city, but post taking of the city, how they behave there, to me goes, hey, you guys can't complain. You were behaving maybe not as effectively, depending on the incident. You were behaving just as badly with your bombings. Don't come to us and say, well, you did it too. Now you're just as bad. No. You've opened the door for it. We see it as a potentially effective campaign because, to the best of my knowledge, they didn't do it just to rub the faces, as the war is collapsing, doing it. And we can get to particularly Japan now. Okay. So those two reasons. One, you have to end these regimes as fast as possible because they're being beastly to humanity. Two, they start the practices. Now, since Japan does do chemical warfare, biological warfare testing, to the best of my knowledge, Germany does not. Germany does have some stockpiles of, mustard gas type weapons, but never uses them. They don't, to the best of my knowledge, go down a biological warfare route. Maybe they did, and I just don't know of it, or knew of it but forgot about it. But Japan is definitely going down it. So the Western allies, who also in America until I think the 90s kept huge stockpiles of chemical warfare weapons, but had a policy of only using them if others started using them. So it's sort of like, well, if you're opening the door to chemical warfare weapons, well, we'll use them too. So don't. Well, they open the door to mass bombing of civilians. So, well, okay, if you're going to open that war, we'll play that game too. Okay. 3, why I'm happy they bombed Japan. And I know there's a lot of weebs, but I was probably a weeb before you were a weeb. If I'm saying that word right, I don't know. And I think samurai culture and all that is really cool to study and whatnot. But I'm happy they bombed Japan. Not just accepting, I'm happy. Because we can see, again, we talked earlier on this live stream about the unwinnable war here, and this sort of got us going down this path. Japan was in a situation of an impossible to win war. They had had all their fleets sunk. The U.S. was almost literally sailing around, not quite maybe fully around all the islands, but looking around here for targets, particularly the U.S. Navy, naval targets to sink, and there was nothing to do. And they were more and more cutting off the limited supply thread chain, whatever you want to call it, from Japan to Korea and there. But because of Korea and because of long-term support in Manchukuo, the Japanese army was able to maintain itself in China fairly well intact. To the best of my knowledge, up until the end, they were not retreating anywhere until really the Soviet Union comes in and attacks there. I do not, again, know of any significant. I'm not saying the nationalist Chinese weren't able to push back some places here, and you could probably show me a campaign chart where they could, and they were definitely being pushed back in Burma by the well, there were Chinese forces that had come down there, but the Indian, the British, Commonwealth, and American forces definitely being pushed back in places here. But basically, their this sort of mainland China empire was, hey, we're good. We got food, we got ammo, we got enough guns for the guys we are, and we're holding back the Chinese. And so Japan was losing all of its naval capacity, losing its even intercoastal shipping capacity, and they were nowhere near any signs of them surrendering. And that is what finally pushes America, and particularly Truman, into a willingness to nuke Japan. Because after the horrific situation in Okinawa, in which, and I've read the biography on Nimitz and talking about some of the stuff here, how, and I read some of the Japanese accounts from the Pacific War from my Japanese series a while ago. The Japanese lied to their population. to the point of telling them, and the people believed it, that the American forces were literally cannibals. They would eat them and eat their children. And they were already doing this. They were lying to them, and they got these. This is why you get civilians suiciding, and I will get to some of the chat here, but suiciding themselves. You can see film footage of it. And not like in a military sense, just jumping off cliffs and whatnot. And yeah, there was probably I'm sure there was social pressure because somebody's there watching them, and there's lots of various social pressure elements in Japan going on. And I'm sure there was some officer with some sword or whatever making sure that the 50 civilians in this cave are going to jump off the cliff first, and then he's going to jump off the cliff or commit seppuku or whatever afterwards. But making sure that I'm sure that also happened too. I mean, I didn't say I know it because we don't have records of what happened in some of these things, but I'm sure that's also the case too. But I'm also sure that some of it is just, from everything we got, people doing it on their own accord because they thought the Americans were literally going to be incredibly beastly to them. And we know from history they weren't. They weren't doing it beforehand, especially the civilian populations. They weren't doing it, including some of the Japanese populations that they did get on some of these islands that did have minor elements of civilian whatevers, but support staff or whatnot. They weren't being beastly to the soldiers. They weren't doing anything of that nature anywhere along the line. And so it was very much, and I think it would have borne true in a large extent, shown to be that invading Japan was going to cost huge amounts, primarily American, but of Allied lives. And so by demonstrating, they picked 4 cities, but they dropped only 2 bombs. I think there was a couple other bombs, but again, I'm not sure on that fact. But alternative cities that were largely unbombed, so that it was a demonstration of what clearly, and they made sure it was clear that it was one bomb falling from the sky and kaboom. And so it was a demonstration attack that happened, if you will, and it was effective. And so it saved huge amounts of American lives. America did not ask for the war with Japan. It was, at most, you could maybe call it economic warfare, but only in the sense that we refused to trade with Japan because Japan is being beastly in China. But I'll say, hey, you know what? Any nation at any time can stop trading with any other nation. I'm worried about that now because we've learned from recent times. China, at least for America, I don't think so much for Europe, but maybe for Europe, China makes a lot of drugs for America. And I don't just mean fentanyl or other sort of things. I mean, proper drugs. Because, hey, starting with Bill Clinton, but also supporting by the Bush years, hey, yeah, let's move our industry to China. It's cheaper. Bad, stupid move, but yeah, America's done it. America's hurting because of it. They've moved lots of industrial production to China, basically shut down American production and opened up new production in China. So yes, I'm definitely afraid of China deciding to just, we'll stop sending medicines to America. Well, what are you going to do about it? And it's China's absolute right to stop trading with America or any other nation in the world. They can just stop. Boom. So if you want to call it economic warfare in Japan, and it was definitely economic pressure to try to get them to stop invading China, but that is no justification for actual military attacks. Now, if America had been putting its fleet out here and trying to stop any other nation from trading with Japan, not, just like, oh, hey, turn around there, Australian ship, you can't go into Japan. Now, of course, Australia, because it's part of the British Empire, also stopped trading with Japan at some point too, mostly over, and the final sort of America stopped trading with, truly stops trading with Japan, was over Japanese occupation of Indochina. That was sort of the last straw. So there is no justification for the attack. America was not looking for a war with Japan. America did not choose that war with Japan, where they were sort of kind of Roosevelt and crew wanting to get in to save Europe from the Nazis. That may have been a war of choice, though of course Hitler makes it not necessary, because Hitler declares war on America too. So America doesn't ask for the war, but America gets drawn into the war. So saving American lives is a worthy task. I could even go, what would be number 4 is, by stopping the war before the actual American invasion landings, we actually end up, I think, saving more Japanese lives than were lost in all of the bombing campaigns, whether the nukes or otherwise. Obviously, I don't have records of what didn't happen, because it didn't happen. But if Okinawa is anything to go by, no, I do not think all of the Japanese population would have suicided or anything to that nature. But I do believe you would have had, shall we say, Islamic fundamentalist type suicide attacks on American forces using explosives, because we see, even in the early days of Khalkhin Gol and whatnot, actual sort of suicide attacks against, say, Soviet tanks, in which a person would hide under a bridge or something with a couple of bombs there, wait for the tanks to drive over, and then hit the fuse, the tip of the bomb with a hammer, blowing himself up and killing the tank, because, hey, it's going to save more of his people, because these tanks are going to kill lots of his soldiers. So we see all the way back into there and before, in desperation, the willingness to do, and of course we've been seeing the kamikaze type attacks, and they were planning, we have records of them planning much more, including very Japanese destroyer captain, that's the name of the book, by Captain Hara, I believe his name is. Very, very good book. It's been translated into English. He wrote it post-war. He was one of the celebrated best destroyer captains in Japan, happened to survive, though he was sunk, but did happen to survive. The war got picked up and survived, picked up by Japanese forces, because he went off on one of the suicide attacks with the Yamato and whatnot. I don't know if it was that exact attack, but his ship got sunk, and he went down with his ship and was floating on wreckage, and they did find him. Wrote about how he, before some of this stuff, or maybe after the sinking, or I think it was after that sinking, he was put in charge of, because of his small boat sort of command skills, in charge of some of the naval actions of, like, suicide attacks of slow motorboats, because they couldn't find fast motorboats, to put large explosives in the front of them and use suicide ramming attacks. And if his whole thought he thought the whole plan was stupid, but he was in charge of it, and he was doing his duty, trying to find a way not to get his people to actually do the attacks. But the idea of ramming the boat, or ramming a ship with a boat kind of thing, with a lot of explosives to sink it. So we know that they were planning these types of things. We have records of it. We have testimony, as in his book, that they were planning this stuff. So yes, it ends up saving even more Japanese lives. So I am happy that Germany, that Japan, and other nations, including bombing, they didn't do huge mass bombings, but they bombed places, factories in Paris that were known to be doing war support work, some munitions factories and whatnot. They bombed, Allied territories for it. I'm happy they did it, because it, I think it does shorten the war. But we can debate whether it was effective or not. But I'm happy that they did those attacks. Not maybe happy that all the civilians died. that's a different matter. Now, of course, got to go, well, hey, if that civilian was making, artillery shells that were going to be fired at my side, well, that's war effort. I mean, that's not just like, hey, we're feeding the population war effort. That's making weapons. Is that so different than launching the weapons? No. So, yeah, I'm happy they bombed and killed the munitions workers. Because, hey, if you can keep them from making the bullets, that keeps them from having to shoot at you. So, yeah, I'm happy they bombed munition factories. Again, all the women and children, no, not so happy, but it's all, they didn't have precision guided weapons, and even if they did, but they didn't. So I'm happy they did all of that. Now let me address some of the situations here that guys have been posting probably wonderful comments telling me how great I am, but let's see. Okay, remember, okay, I decided to put your finger on some of those. Asked the question, what would happen when this valve would break? They said it was easy, 5 minutes of heated discussion. They took blueprints and said we would repair it. Okay, catching up. Even in the U.S., nuclear safety wasn't that great. I also remember how Freeman basically forced his superiors to reduce secrecy to allow workers to have at least some clue about what they were making. Otherwise, it would have caused more explosions. Yeah, I'm not saying that it was modern health and safety levels, but I do believe the American industry overall, war industry, was concerned about health and safety. But yeah, that may take a secondary approach, even outside of nuclear weapons programs, to production levels. Meaning, if you're dealing with explosives and you're putting them in artillery shells or bombs or even large amounts of gunpowders that go into regular rifle type bullets, when it's stored in large volumes, they were worried about the workers' safety, and they end up killing a lot of workers, or maybe not killing them, shortening their lives, because they use asbestos as a fire retardant, and of course we now know asbestos gives you cancer. They didn't use asbestos and didn't care that it gives you cancer. They didn't know that it did at the time. Now they continue probably somewhat using it afterwards, and they're still cleaning up problems of it to this day. But yeah, they're trying, and even just like on safety, is that if you blow up a armaments factory because of carelessness, or you have a trained machinist, nowhere near an explosive thing, a machinist who whether it's the woman who catching her hair, but just rams a hand into the machine and chews up that hand. Well, now you've taken a machinist out of work. Now, maybe, war work, he may be able to teach other people to do some of the job and still contribute, but still, you don't want to do that. So they were concerned, but it may have not been the highest priority there. It's, if you're making toasters today, there, in any sort of developed country, there's actually no excuse for not having reasonable worker safety. You can't make everything, you can't remove all sharp corners, but, so people can still be hurt, people can still die in industrial accidents, they do. But you don't go, well, hey, we don't care if one worker dies per 10,000 toasters because, because it's just an economic endeavor to make money. And to maybe help society, because people need toasted bread. They do. But, so you're making toasters. But it's different when you're making munitions or making anything else for the war effort. You do need certain levels of production. So, yeah, there's a trade-off, I'll grant you. But it's still, they were, to be honest, World War II is like a big Lev Tolstoy novel with lots of plots and big dramatic endings that leaves an empty feeling inside. Probably the best art piece in human history. And I don't know if I'm quite going to go to the best art piece, but I am fascinated by the topic of World War II for sure. A huge amount is still sitting in a huge amount. British, Russian archives. Oh, okay, yes, I will grant you. Part of what we have with records is maybe well filed in archives. I think some of the stuff is in archives but not archived, meaning it just boxes over in the corner. And when I talk about a lot of stuff that I have access to, I'm talking secondary sources in books that I can go and buy, or maybe primary sources, because I do collect documents that are, again, digitally, but documents that are primary sources. So I do, some of my research is literally primary resources, research resources. But again, what's online, like Hitler's Compromises, the author goes and looks at the archives, and he can read German, and he's writing a book. So what he gets access to, what is around, but I also know lots of it is just literally is gone. So there's some of it is just gone. Some of it is just piles of stuff still to go through. And unless somebody is actually have the ability to go through it, both physical access and like language skills, yeah, that is a big thing. Still going through IKB. Let's see, World War II need to be. Oh, there's still stuff that World War II particularly may need to be classified. The bomber, yes, Curtis LeMay, that's right. Fergus is Nukes policy. Great, IKB. I'm catching up. Croatia, some of the early electronic warfare stuff is still classified, even though, some of the stuff. Well, the movie star Hedy Lamarr was the person who develops what eventually was one of the primary people that developed some technology during the war for the war effort, but never gets actually used during the war, but afterwards then eventually develops into Bluetooth. So look up Hedy Lamarr. It's a very good point you're making here. Some numbers Germans took 900,000 Italian soldiers appeared before of these died of starvation in camps. 13,000 were executed. An additional 12,000 were killed during naval transportation. Nazis also executed roughly 30,000 civilians in retaliation. Grand total of Italian Jews killed in camps about 6,000. There's all kinds of beastly stuff going on. We focus on the Jews, and I don't mind focusing on the Jews, but I don't want it to just seem like, for whatever reasons, just defending Jews, or Jews were just this, or whatever, giving modern neo-Nazis their sort of whatever propagandistic thing. It's much more than just the Jews, but they were being beastly to huge. And I'm sort of, you may say being beastly, it's just sort of like, somebody just sort of, making light of it. I don't. And I watch myself on YouTube, because the more controversial the topic, the more likely it is to get demonetized and all of that. And I don't mean my videos to be a horror show of recounts of horrors of World War II. And I've watched, I've watched Schindler's List once. I don't ever need to watch it again. I've learned the lessons of it. I don't think I need to know the details, of it. It's a horrific movie. It's important to watch. I'm glad they made the movie. I think it's all true. I mean, as in a piece of historical fiction based in truth, but the conditions, the situations, all of that element is true. Not who said what, when, or any sort of detail, but the overall story arc, I believe, is entirely true, and the conditions were entirely true. So, and I've watched enough documentaries. I don't dwell in that realm of it. I'm, as people who've watched enough, I am interested in turning points in the war. I'm fascinated with history. I'm fascinated with Nazi regalia, all of the uniforms of all of the different stuff, all that kind of stuff. That minutia of it fascinates me. Doesn't make me sympathetic to their views or justify their actions. Still just makes me fascinated by some of the topics going on there. Okay, aren't cities valuable gold bottlenecks or something? Yes, they can be. When fighting a total war, everything in any way helps the enemy. Yes, absolutely, IKB. There is definitely that element, and it was a total war. And it was a total war, I would say, initially pushed that it's a total war was by Germany itself, and possibly Japan. So the wind, you shall reap the whirlwind. Absolutely, IKB. The U.S. could simply send a peace proposal to ban some negotiations. Japan would accept it without nukes. Okay. Well, I think it's is it the Potsdam Declaration that they state that and it does push some of the nations into the corner, that they will only accept unconditional surrender. They weren't going to, it was going to be surrender or no. Now, and if we're looking, and Germany does not, I mean, technically there is a surrender. What is it? Admiral Donitz, who becomes the leader of the Third Reich, signs the, what is it, in Hanover or someplace like that, signs the instrument of surrender for Germany. Italy is allowed to surrender. The king stays in power. The fascist Grand Council removes Mussolini. They become not an ally. They're not allowed to become the allies, but they're allowed to become a co-belligerent against Germany, and in which Italian royalist forces fight, though in a minor way, more in an internal security way, fight in Italy. And that is part of the reason why, not just that Italy surrenders, and Germany does what they do to the Italian soldiers, Van Bishop, but it's partially that Italy actually becomes a co-belligerent against Germany, not just a peace out. Japan and surrendering. Okay, anecdotal but true, is when some elements of the Japanese military get wind that the emperor has surrendered, and that he has made a record, and the way he's going to get the information out to the Japanese people and to the Western allies, the method he's able to get it out is that he has made a recording of him accepting the surrender to the allies, on a record, and they are trying to get this record to a radio station to broadcast it into Japan, telling the Japanese people, the Japanese military, as well as the allies, we surrender. However he says it. My Japanese isn't good enough, and I may have heard the recording at some point, but that is going to happen. The Japanese military that is particularly loyal to the emperor and is basically the Imperial Guard, the Royal Palace facilities has its own Imperial Guard element. It's theoretically part of the army, I understand, but is somewhat separated, I guess. I don't know the details of that. I don't know how long-standing it had been sort of separated. It had previously sort of been surrounded by other military forces, army forces, not Navy. The Navy's happy to surrender, quite honestly. The Navy wants to surrender. The Navy doesn't want the war, but that's another whole story. But hey, steel's cool, so they accept the bribe of steel, increased steel, if they'll support going to war against America. And so, yeah, they get more steel. Instead of going steel to the Army, steel to the Navy, so they accept it. But they want out of it before. But the Army still wants to fight the war. So the Army, even before this, has surrounded the Imperial Palace outside, looking in, while the Imperial Guard is looking out. And there's a brief civil war, if you will, between these two forces in attempting to stop or carry out or whatever, play the recordings of Japan surrendering. And the forces not just want to stop that, but actually probably not planning on killing the emperor. But the emperor's younger brother, had been very yay Nazis, yay, we ought to ally with these Nazi guys. He was one of the main people pushing at a high level, and he actually travels to Germany, the emperor's brother, pushing for this is like a 1938-39 kind of situation, before the war starts, is maybe even 37, I don't know, is trying to create a Nazi-Japanese alliance. He might be, as a potential successor, might be someone who wants to continue the war. So they might even, the emperor died, of natural causes, of course, trying to end the war. But whether they would have killed him or just simply isolated him to not allow him to surrender, I do not know. And I think to point the fates, would have determined some of that, meaning the battle to make him prisoner might have been ferocious enough that he would have died in the fighting or whatnot, or somebody just would have done it, killed him once they got possession of him. But there is not an appetite. I mean, they've already back, I think it's in late 44, they've already dismissed Tojo as Prime Minister of Japan. He's removed from all of his duties and put under house arrest, well before Japan's ready to surrender. So Tojo's already been removed from the government. Tojo being the guy who is in charge of the Kempitai in Manchukuo before he comes back and starts running other departments. He ends up being, I think, head Prime Minister and head of 2 or 3 other major departments like education and whatnot. Basically, he's controlling these kinds of things within the government. So there really wasn't much of an appetite by the army to accept the surrender. And I do not really see the Japanese army accepting a surrender that is going to require them to withdraw from Manchukuo, to require them to withdraw from Korea even, requiring them to withdraw, we'll use the period name Formosa here. I don't see that in their appetite at the time. Because the army, they've been defeated on all these little islands that the Navy couldn't protect. Yeah, they've been defeated again in the Philippines, where the Navy couldn't protect. Yeah, they've been maybe pushed out of Burma, but they're still holding, Indonesia, Indonesia, Indochina. They're still holding a lot of it. So the army really hasn't been defeated, and with the sort of Japanese mentality that I know reasonably well, they may think that they could bleed America white. Kill 2 or 3 million American soldiers. They'll not want to keep fighting, and so they'll negotiate a surrender that'll be more suitable to us. A negotiated peace. And so I don't see that anywhere. Any offer that would be acceptable to the political leadership of most nations, Japanese would have been willing to accept. I just don't see that as being a realistic thing.